Anse, Manisha Netsigasun, Notavi Pan Balwant, Ekwa Nigavi Bimla, Nitatos Kan Masnahigan Kamek, Musquachis Cultural College, Mistahini Nanaskamon Pematis Soin, Emikosia. My name is Manisha, and I'm recording um, two dissertations assignment. I'll begin with a prayer. Notavinan semanto sabihininan, wichihinan mina, kanawayininan, anuj gagisigak, nianan kitavasimisak, napewak, napesisak, isquevisisak, ekwa, kahakyo, kotagak, aisiniwak ota, askihik, kita tamihinan, hi. So thank you, Creator, for this opportunity to share with my colleagues the two dissertations. I selected two dissertations. The first one is by Dr. Paulina Johnson, and the title of the dissertation is A Kavo Taniket 1876, Reclaiming Nehiyao Governance in the Territory of Musqueam through Wakatoan Kinship. She did her doctorate degree in 2017 from Western University, but all the content and the topic is from Musqueam, and she's a member of Samson Cree Nation. The second dissertation is written by Dr. Onawa McIver in 2012. The title of the dissertation is Ikavi Nehiya Viyan. I'm learning to be Cree. And she received her doctorate degree from the University of British Columbia. The flow of information is as follows. First, I'll be speaking a little bit more about introducing the Indigenous scholars, Dr. Paulina Johnson and Dr. Inowa McWaver. And I'll use Dr. Onowa because it's a Cree name to refer to Dr. Onowa McWaver. Then we learn a little bit about the place, the land, the values, worldviews, followed by the framework, paradigms, and a range of different methodologies I was introduced to in this research. I'll focus a little bit more on autoethnographic approach and story work as a qualitative Indigenous research methodology, with a note about cycles and cyclical framework, and conclude by with an overview of the review criteria which I created for this project. So Dr. Onawa McIver, Maskiko Nehiyao. She's a Swampy Cree from northern Saskatchewan. And in her career, she began with focusing on how children learn language through language nest programs, and that was from University of Victoria. And then she moved to University of British Columbia, where she completed her doctorate degree with a focus on how do adults, in particular urban adults, learn their Indigenous languages. Dr. Paulina Johnson, Sipiko Kisiko Isqueo. She's a Nehiyao, Plains Cree from Samson Cree Nation in Musqueam, and she completed a PhD in anthropology from Western University in Ontario. Her focus was on Nehiyao law and governance, and her current research interest is to study about Indigenous, the importance of Indigenous women's voices and matriarchal resistance to oppressive systems that are embedded in our colonial societies. Currently, she's an employee, assistant professor at the University of Alberta in the sociology department as an assistant professor. Let's look at the land. Where did these two Indigenous scholars come from? Dr. Onawa McIver is from northern Saskatchewan, Treaty 8 area. She's lived a lot in the Treaty 8 area. So from northern Saskatchewan, where her family origin is, and then her degree was in, she spent a lot of time learning about different indigenous languages which are spoken in British Columbia. This is a beautiful land where I work. Samson Cree Nation is Muscogee's Cultural College is located next to Samson Cree Nation, and this is a reserve land. And Dr. Paulina Johnson is from Samson Cree Nation, which is in Treaty 6 area. And the Treaty 6 area, we are very close to Edmonton. So we are just 45 minutes south of Edmonton. For values, I picked up the logo of the Cree, Samson Cree Nation, and you can see the different animals. So eagle stands for Isahotowin, which means tolerance. The buffalo stands for Sagitowin, love. The bear stands for Sokitowin, which is strength. And the Mahigan, the wolf, stands for Wakatowin. I think we need to offer more protocol in order to understand more about the values, and values are different for each nation. I found the cyclical representation of the values from Solomon Rad's languages. He's written lots of stuff about different languages, and languages in the center. Peaksquaven. Peaksquaven is language. Family is Peakohe Wamak. Atoya Kaven, which is stories, storytelling, and I am using highlighting, focusing on story work as a methodology for all stages in writing, in writing about indigenous knowledge, indigenous works, and stories. Stories are evocative. They make the information come alive in various different formats. Some stories are about teachings, lessons. And in Muscogees, when elders are telling stories, we call it teachings. It's up to the listener to interpret the meaning of the stories. Then there are stories about history, stories about place names. There is a story about how Muscogees, the place name where the Muscogees Cultural College is located and the reserve. It was previously it was called, I think, 8 years ago. It was called Hobima, and Hobima was the name given after a Dutch artist. I've also heard stories that Hobima was the name given because somebody was going on the horse, and they stopped the horse, and when you stop the horse, because people were into rodeo, you say, "Oh, Bhima, oh, Bhima." So there are multiple stories and there are multiple truths, and natural cycles. To learn the language, it's just like there are different seasons, land-based learning, Mother Nature is always teaching us. So the natural cycles are extremely important. Spirituality. Spirituality, the spirit and intent behind all our actions is so important. Just like the treaties was signed with pipe as being sacred. That's the story about how treaties are signed. As long as the sun shines, the river flows and the grass grows. Spirituality is a very important component. It's a way of life, worldviews, and values, and there are certain protocols need to be given in order to learn more about spirituality. So this is a chart which I drew about how in the indigenous worldviews, are one with Mother Nature, Mother Nature, and with all living creatures. It could be water-based creatures, and I'll share a story later in this presentation. The two-winged creatures, and with all human forms, and oral histories um, is a tradition. It's the way in which how knowledge was transmitted uh, um, through generations in indigenous communities. So the word teaching is land-based, cyclical, reciprocal, relational, and lifelong, and it takes place in everyday context, from watching, listening, doing. So practices do matter, and the words which I hear in Muskuchis are um, the kanawapam nitota. Kanawapam nitota, it means listen. And I've used the technique when if you if you're in a class and you want to manage all the students, just like in ceremonies, the person conducting the ceremony says "Utotamuk," and everybody keeps quiet. What it means is that, as a mark of respect, it's time for you to listen. So Dr. Onova McCower, this here is her another photograph of her presenting, and I have some links I have posted in case you want to learn more about it. Next, I'll speak about the theoretical frameworks, the methodologies used. So indigenous methodologies have been the first and foremost the reaction against research and the effects of indigenous peoples' knowledge and history. Um, and this impacts the discussion of indigenous methodologies, since it is through the way of thinking that tensions arise among Western scholars, and why indigenous people struggle to share their knowledge due to how they have been educated in the Western institutions that limit their ability to see outside the fact and evidence. So Louise, my colleague, said stories are very important for validating indigenous knowledge. By incorporating indigenous alternate ways of thinking, we react to intellectual colonization and reaffirm indigenous knowledge by respecting indigenous ontologies, epistemologies. Stories, Achimovina, oral narratives, Wakatowin relationships and relationality, personal learning and language. Um, Indigenous people also believe that in visions, so knowledge is given to you via dreams, and people go for vision quest for 4 days and spend time in finding meaning for themselves. Um, and it's through the meditation, fasting, the they are bestowed with gifts from the creator. So the terms used by scholars for research should not reflect a Western view of collecting and finding, but instead it should reflect the views of obtaining through past traditional practice, um, ancestral knowledge through oral histories, and to include terms such as searching, harvesting, picking, gathering, hunting, and trapping. Decolonization, I find, has been the base in both the dissertations. Um, in both the dissertations I have selected. And decolonization includes indigenous ways of thinking, such as ideas about citizenship, governance, organizational structures, education, oral traditions, Peaksquawen, which is the language, images and stereotypes, died, and as well as most important, the role of truth telling, epistemologies. Truth telling is not just important right now because of the reconciliation um, phase we are in, but truth telling in Muskuchis, we use the word tapwe. Autoethnographic um, was the methodology used by Dr. Onova. And it's a form of qualitative research in which the author uses self-reflection, and she's used many of journal entries which she wrote throughout, like more than 5 years, 10 years. She has been writing in her journals, and she weaved beautifully her journals with stories and photographs from her families um, and shared anecdotal and her personal experience, um, uh, and stories for the wider cultural, political, social meaning and understanding. So Dr. Johnson also placed herself. This is graphic representation taken from her dissertation, where she's placing herself, her family, nation, ancestors, allies, which are both human as well as not human, um, animate or inanimate. Further, again, the cyclical representation of the community of living, life, relationships, and associates. So this is a family cycle by Clarence Whitstone, who is from Onion Lake. Um, and why I picked this not just to show the circular representation and relatives and supporters and protectors and role of men, women, men as warriors or providers, protectors, hunters, trappers. Um, I also picked it up because the person who's teaching me the Cree language in Muscogees is from Onion Lake. Viche Kaskasi Ino Sagaigan means onion lake. Onion. Viche Kaskasi. Viche Kaskasi also means stinky, stinky, stinky. So um, a stinky man. When Viche Kaskasiino, Viche Kaskasiino, Viche Kaskasiino, Viche Kaskasiino. This is how Ken, my colleague, who's the custodian at the college, is teaching me Cree. He's a fluent Cree speaker. And he taught me, so we are always joking. And this is another way in which I'm sharing on about how, as an adult, as a racialized settler, I'm learning the Cree language. Um, so how creator um, um, connected um, all the living creatures with the cyclical ways in which how all animate, inanimate um, things can function in harmony is through different laws. Via Sevin, Via Sevin, this Via Sevin, how Manito Via Sevina interconnects is from Dr. Johnson's dissertation. So there are four different laws, and these laws are represented in the medicine wheel cycle with Semanto, the creator, in the center, the sacred law, the natural law, the traditional law, and the customary law. The seasons and natural elements is quail, is woman, and fire is quaitio. Um, and I'll speak more about these in this section. I'm next focusing on story work as a methodology, and this was used by Dr. Johnson. Um, so indigenous story work is a result. Uh, the research is a result of different stories which are collected, and stories are weaved in all different chapters. When literature review is conducted, in the methodologies as well as um, in the data which was collected, and the way in which the data was collected through oral stories, and finally how it is interpreted and analyzed, and how the stories have the power to educate and heal. Most important word is healing. Healing in our academic scholarship. That's why I like when Dr. Raga begins our sessions with mindfulness. It's a way of not just grounding myself to forget about other things and to focus on my focus on the topic we are covering, but at the same time mindfulness is also healing, in my opinion. So story work builds on 7 principles, and they are respect, responsibility, reciprocity, reverence, holism, interrelatedness, and synergy that form a framework for understanding the characteristics of stories and appreciating the process of storytelling, and as well as establishing a receptive learning context and engaging in a holistic meaning making. So Joanne Archibald is the researcher. She's from Coast Salish area, and she worked with elders and storytellers and developed this methodology. Um, and she built many connections with the Maori people and the University of Auckland um, during her career. So her book explains, speaks more about the story basket, the bone needle, and weaving the seven principles which I have read. Um, Next, I'll share some stories from Johnson's dissertation. She begins in her chapter one, in the introduction. Um, and I'm just saying the title of the story is Nehiao. Nehiao is four-bodied people. And the root word is nevo, the first, which means four. Yao means body. That's why four-bodied people, Nehiao, and they're also known as plains Cree people. Um, Here in Muscogees. So she begins with saying that in the time before there were human beings on earth, and the Creator called a great meeting of the animal people. And during that period of the world's history, animal people lived harmoniously with one another, and they could speak to the Creator with one mind. They were very curious about the reason for the gathering. And when they all assembled together, Semanto, the Creator, spoke, I'm sending a strange new creature to live among you, he told the animal people. And he is to be called man, and he is to be a brother. Hmm. All the animals who were listening, they kept quiet because they were curious to know more. Um, and the Creator asked that I'm going to um, give him extra knowledge, and where should we keep that knowledge? Hmm. Salmon said that I can keep it with me, and it will be safe. It'll be deep down in the river. um, the creator mentioned, no, that's not the right place, because man will be very powerful with this gift of knowledge which I am giving him, and he can create um, vehicles which can travel, such as submarines in the water. um, so water is not to give you, it will not be safe. And again, there was a murmur amongst the um, audience. Then a very small creature mole came and said, um, that why don't you give it to me, and we can, I can keep it inside. um, the mole suggested that I have another suggestion, rather than giving it to us, me or someone, how about you put it inside man itself? Then man would have to learn about truth and justice. And the creator thought that's a great idea, and all the animals agreed that the gift of knowledge will be within each man and within each person's Mamtone Chikan. And it will not be stored in, within an animal or within Mother Earth. The gift of knowledge is within each person. So that was the beginning of her chapter one in her dissertation. Um, Leroy Lee Little Bear is cited the story in Johnson's dissertation, and he's from Blood Reserve, Kainai First Nation. He says that indigenous languages are generally aimed at describing happenings rather than objects. And languages do not have any boundaries. And if everything is alive, then you look like me and I look like you. That means we are all related to each other and we are all animate. Hedi with Nipissnick Stark of Turtle Mountain, Ojibwe article, Stories as Law, it's a method to live by. This is taken from Dr. Johnson's dissertation. Methods are not just a tool for the study of the past and present. They illuminate ways forward. Um, and ways forward, this indigenous knowledge, and using it in academia, uh, it's about practices. What do we do next? And if movement, when we use the word pathways, indigenous, it's knowledge journeys where we are thinking about and we are moving. And that movement comes also from traditional practices where indigenous tribes were moving, whether it was to collect medicines, they knew the cyclical, the cycles, and knew where to camp. So pathways, journeys, the words which we are using, it also demonstrates movement. So next, I'll share a couple of stories from McCover's dissertation. He's using the Swampy Cree, and where I work in Muscogees, we use the Y dialect. So spellings are a bit different. In Swampy Cree, Moose Cree, I think they are using I, and in Muscogees, the Y dialect, we spell it with using the Y. And she explains how languages are the foundation uh, for our culture and worldview, and it contains our belief systems, laws, and our decision-making practices, child rearing practices, songs, place names, history of the land, history of our migration, and our family histories. When children are they are born, they are primarily given um, the year primary, the languages which are being spoken and sung to them repeatedly, night after night, around the fire and later at the kitchen table. Um, so, how children learn a language is different from how adults learn a language. But kitchen table is used by her in her dissertation to show as a place where conversation happens, or whether visiting is a form of speaking and learning the language. Ga- um, Dr. Onowa identified many gaps in her literature review, and she said there are many gaps about how adults learn indigenous um, languages, indigenous second language learning. So she shares with very intensive literature review about how immersion schools are there for K to 12, how language nest, and her master's degree was about language nest as a way for like Head Start programs or early literacy to learn the Cree language. But the information about adult indigenous second language learning uh, is not much, and that's a gap which she identified. Um, she also studied about the Maori and the Hawaiians and looked at their best practices and models, and what we can learn from both of them is that they do not have many different dialects like we do. Um, uh, Different dialects within one language. So there are many different indigenous languages all over, but within a language like in Muscogees, we Plains Cree. Plains Cree, there are many different dialects. The Moose Cree, Swampy Cree, the Muscogees Cree, which is our local dialect. So what she's saying is that people who are learning the language fast, they are able to learn the language because they're speaking the same dialect. And I also will cite later, maybe in the other assignments, we are working with the University of Alberta, and they came up with the same conclusion that Muscogees people are very focused on their Muscogees Y dialect, and there are certain ways in which certain words need to be spoken, articulated, and spelled. Um, for example, we do not use the word like a cross. For ya sound, we use the word X because the cross represents Christianity, and we're very particular of using the um, the X. So next, Shauna, sorry, Onawa is sharing that she's a Nehiyaw Cree woman, and she's conversationally proficient in her matrilineal ancestral language. And um, just she's saying that she used blended autoethnography. She used blended autoethnographic and indigenous research methodology. So in her dissertation, there are many different types of autoethnographic approaches, and she mentioned meta autoethnographic as one of the ways. So even within autoethnography, there are many different subtypes, but I need to learn a little bit more about autoethnographic and different types. So being specific and generalist. Um, as the choice is to focus this study as one of the indigenous story in a particular context. It's both purposeful and significant. And Dr. Onowa McCover's project contains one important design feature, which is pertaining to the issue of generalizability that warrants description. The emergence of the concept of specificity in Indigenous research. Specificity is a move towards acknowledging the diversity among Indigenous people as a reaction to the homogenization that has been exposed through colonization. And Dr. Johnson, in her dissertation, uses Nehiyaw epistemology and Nehiyaw methodology. Next, couple of next we'll speak about cycles, how Mother Nature is teaching us. Freezing up, Kaskatina Wow. This season signifies foundations of Dr. Onowa's journey with the language. While winter hunting and trapping continues, Kaskatina Wow is a time in the Nehiyaw territory when the earth rests and Muskwa, which is the bear, sleep in their dens. It's a time for hibernation. Families travel less. Rather, individual family members go out to set the trap line. A thick layer of ice forms on the rivers and lakes, and this time is referred to as Kaskatina Wow, literally meaning freezing over. And in her maternal family, the once vibrant Nehiyabawan began to go to sleep, and they rested there for several decades. Winter time. Winter time, the season of winter is called Pipun, signifies her childhood. Avasisak. Avasisak is child, and Avasisak comes from two different root words. Uh, Avikosowin, which is something precious that it is loaned to you. Like children are loaned to you by Creator. Avikosowin. And second word is Kisikosis. So Kisikosis comes means little sky beings. So Avasis or child comes from two different root words. Again, Kisikosis, again, little sky beings um, denotes spirituality. In northern Canada, winters are long and cold, yet Pipun is a cleansing time for trees, rivers, and lakes. Traditionally, it was a time for slowing down. The summer and fall harvest were complete. Foods were preserved and treasured in hopes they would last until spring. Families were large, but homes were not. And so it was a time for family closeness. This was a time for telling Ateokana sacred stories, told only at this time of the year, often at the night by the fire or candlelight. The night sky seemed brighter and the northern lights danced, a magical phenomenon known to most as aurora borealis. But to Nehiyaw people, it's referred as Chipayak Nemitowak. Spirits, spirits are dancing. In her journal entries, she has featured Dr. Onowa McCover that she learned in a family from her parents and grandparents and her mother that be proud of yourself, identity. Learning the language is also about um, ig- uh, about one's identity. So her journal entry goes like this. When I was a child, my mother would tell us stories about her parents and grandparents and trips back to their home territory. She would say, "You are Aboriginal. Always be proud of it." She encouraged us to develop a sense of cultural identity and yet had such limited means to assist us in this journey. Although we lived in Cree territory, it was not our territory, and all of our living relations lived hundreds and thousands of miles away. So springtime, again, the season goes leaf budding moon, but springtime means Sege Patwan. It means new beginnings. Then comes summer, and I've heard so many stories about summer. We had a cultural teachings week last week, and Chief Randy Aminskin mentioned, do you know why the leaves fall down, from in summer? So that the tree could rest, the arms could rest. Um, but let's go to our summertime. The new season of Nippy means water also. Nippin involves much hard work, and IMC Veena. IMC Veena is challenges. IMC Veena. It's a time for harvest and preserve both plants and animals, picking Minisa berries, pickling Muskikia, picking, sorry, picking medicines, Muskiki, and humbly pleading to say Mantu, the creator, for offering moose, moose to hunt. And this is a great time, she mentioned summertime in her language learning. And it's also a time for gratitude. Um, and Each season has its own language. So, Mother Nature and the way of living, language is so intricately weaved in, like buffalo hunt is done. So, there is certain vocabulary associated with the buffalo hunt. There's certain vocabulary associated with picking berries. Vinsa. How do you say basket? How do you pick berries? From where do you pick berries? Which are the ripe berries? And There are certain rules when you're picking berries. Mothers would say, don't eat those berries, because then they would make many things from the berries, mix it with the meat, and that would be pemmican would be used as food during the summer. It's another story, a really interesting story from Leanne Hinton, and Onawa captured it from a public lecture in 2003. She mentions a man was trying to learn his language, but he did not know any speakers other than his language mentor. So he therefore had very few others with whom he could talk. Yet he was determined to learn his language. So he began a practice of talking to everyone in his language. He responded to every question he was asked and initiated conversation in his language, then followed with the English translation. And he reported that this practice also helped him to make note of what he did not yet know. And then he focused on that vocabulary area with his language mentor. His tremendous dedication and creative way of finding a way to speak his language regularly was very admirable. So the results or findings of how adults learn a language, are also written in the form of stories in Dr. Onowa's dissertation. Uh, Finally, I'd like to focus on indigenous languages. Indigenous languages, the syllabics we believe were given to us by Colin Beger. Colin Beger went to the spiritual world when he suddenly fell ill, and the spirits gave him these syllabics. And this is a story told by Wes Finde. Um, and Wes Finde is related to many people in Muscogees. He's related to the Little Popular family. That's where kinship comes into the picture too. Um, More protocol needs to be done in order to hear the full story. So these are the spirit markers or syllabics. And in Muscogees Cultural College, at our college, we believe syllabics first approach. Um, so along with these syllabics, there are these diphthongs. So 36 letters plus these um, 36 um, letters followed plus these 11 diphthongs combined together make at least more than 500 sounds. So it goes like this: a, e, I, o, pa, pe, pi, po, ta, te, ti, to, ka, ke, ki, ko, cha, che, chi, cho, ma, me, mi, mo, na, ne, ni, no, sa, se, si, so, ya, ye, yo. And the diphthongs go like this: wa, au, pa, ta, ka, cha, yeah, ha. So these are the sounds which are the base of learning of the Plains Cree dialect language. So the language which is written in the English form, like kayas, means history. So when people begin telling stories, they'll say kayas. Payak, kayas means historic and like long time ago. And payak means once upon a time, like payak, they'll begin with that. But the writing style in Onawa McCowart's dissertation, she has written um, in standard Roman orthography, and she's not used syllabics, which is followed by in bracket the translation in the English language. These are the standard 4 chapters. I found that both the um, researchers, scholars, indigenous scholars, use the same format of doing introductions, literature review, and then followed by uh, methodology. And depending on the methodology, like autoethnographic approach was used, the title is different. Netachi Win, which means my story, is used by Dr. Onawa Makeover to, because it's an autoethnographic approach. So she's the creator and she's creating things. She's a storyteller and she's the story. Autoethnographic approach. And Nehi Yawak being is what Dr. Johnson used, because she is using Nehiyao epistemology and the Nehiyao methodology. And both of them conclude by some final thoughts and some next steps. So Dr. Johnson, not in her dissertation, but I discovered in 2016, she um, developed open source tools for indigenous language assessments. So this is just one screenshot of beginner level, but notice the cyclical way in which assessment tool is presented, and it's online. She's also developed movement, an organization called NILA. So this is a snapshot from NILA, which is National Indigenous Language Initiative. So finally, the review criteria I presented had 5 different categories with protocols in the center: stories, relationships, Wakatoan language, and places. It's also ethical space. It's also situating yourself, and it's also about sovereignty. And then I did list down many subcategories, but more time needs to be done to write descriptions for the subcategories. Both the indigenous scholars followed the academic standard of writing the same 6 chapters in the dissertation. And finally, I'd like to conclude with autumn. And this is from Onoma McCover's Preparing a New Journey, because it relates to what I'm doing right now too. And this is the season we are currently in. Takawan is a time for preparation. The days are beginning to shorten and the nights are getting colder. Takawan is a gentle reminder that Pipun is on its way. It is also a time of the year in the natural world that signifies maturation, another cycle of growth coming to an end, which ultimately signals another cycle beginning. Takwaken represents the past 2 years of my journey. She's presenting, and I'm saying that because we're coming to the close of our course. So, Kinanasko Mitin, which means I thank the Creator for creating all of you. And I'd like to once again conclude with a closing prayer. Notavinan se manto savehi minan, wichihinan mina, kana wehi minan, anuj gagisigak. Nianan kitawasan isak na pewak na pesisak iskwewak iskwebi ekwa kakyo kotagak ay siniwak uta. Aski kita tamihinan. Ai, kinanasko mitin. Which means I thank the Creator for creating all of you. So thank you so much. And in plain Cree, we do not say bye, we always say exe moistas egosi petama, which means that's it for now till we meet again later.